Nothing But the Truth. Hello, I'm Raj Chengappa of India Today and your host for Nothing But the Truth. This is my weekly X-ray of key issues that matter to you without holding back on the truth. First, let me give you a dubious distinction. India has become the world's largest contributor to plastic emission pollution. Yes, India is the world's largest plastic emission polluter. Now, according to a study last year, India emits an estimated 9.3 million tons of unmanaged plastic waste annually. That's about 20% of the global total, and it tops every other country, including China, which in fact produces far more plastic overall than India, but when it comes to waste, we top the list. Now, such massive amounts of emission from plastic waste severely impacts our health and also our environment. So in this episode, we will analyze how India reached such a dangerous and sorry pass, and why the problem will only grow worse, and what are the solutions to reduce the threat of plastic waste. The word plastic comes from the Greek word plastikos, which means moldable. Plastic was chemically synthesized over 100 years ago and was found to be super light, sturdy, waterproof, and cheap. So plastic found its way into every industry, including in India, from packaging and construction to healthcare, cars, and everyday household items that you and I use, including bottles and cups. Now, just a little more classification of plastic so we get to understand the real problem that's there. Based on their behavior, especially when heated, plastics are broadly divided into two categories. One is thermoplastics, which become soft when you heat them and can be melted and reshaped about 2 or 3 times, which makes them recyclable. The best examples of these are the water bottles that we use, the disposable cups, shopping bags, and then there is the other category of plastics called thermosets, which can only be molded once after heating and therefore cannot be recycled. Now, some examples of thermosets are Bakelite and melamines that are used for electrical insulation, cookware, and even auto and industrial components. Today, if you look at it, India's plastic sector is worth around rupees 3.5 lakh crore, and there are close to 30,000 processing units, mostly small and medium enterprises, which employ more than 4 million people. That's how big the plastic industry is, and some say it constitutes about 1.4% of India's GDP and therefore is a very important sector. Now, India ranks among the top 3 global consumers of plastics, and no guesses which are the other 2, China, of course, and the US. But we still have a lower per person usage or per capita usage, which is around 13 kg per year, versus the global average of 30 kgs. So 13 we use, 30 kgs is the global average annually. But that is of not any great comfort, because let's be clear, the issue isn't consumption, it is plastic waste management, and we don't do that well. The problem with plastics is that they are not biodegradable. They don't disappear. They just turn into smaller and smaller pieces called microplastics and even nanoplastics that get into the soil, get into water, air, and even the food we eat. Now, recent studies are very, very worrying. Scientists have detected the microplastics in human tissue. Not only in terms of ingestion from food or water, we are breathing plastics too. They've been found circulating through our bloodstream, and some have even found their way into our major organs like the heart and our brains. Animals suffer too. A cow in Gujarat who had an ailment, and when they operated on its stomach, it was found that it had 65 kgs of plastic in its stomach, and this included bags, disposable cups, and everything else that's there. So the real problem, if you analyze and look at what the problem is and why we are such, or we are the world's leader in terms of plastic waste emissions, the problem in India is that only 12% of the plastic waste gets recycled. Now, if you take a look at another serious aspect, 20% of our plastic is burned, which means that it spews out toxic gases, and the remaining 70%, which is a massive 70%, ends up, as you can see when you go to any city, in landfills, dumps, or piles along our roads. And combined, that means most plastic isn't just disappearing, it becomes part of our landscape, it is poisoning our soil, our air, and of course, certainly our health. Interestingly, some of the biggest names in industry are seen as some of the bigger polluters. And when I use the word plastic polluters, I also talk about producers who produce a lot. And if you look at some of that in a major report about 4 years ago, a report called Unwrapped, it was an international report, and they flagged companies like Unilever, companies that we are very familiar, Pepsi-Cola, Nestle, and of course, Amazon. These were seen as major polluters. And that's because many of these companies pump out multi-layered plastics that are nearly impossible to recycle. Of course, these companies deny, polluting the atmosphere through plastics, and they say they've taken steps, but the report, as I said, indicated many of these big companies were, in fact, contributing to it. And if you take a look at the other big problem, it is not just the big producers of plastic that's the problem. Plastics are being manufactured, as I mentioned earlier, largely in the small and medium sector. And here, recycling of plastics comes with a very high cost, and not many of them are willing to pay that cost to do so. So what these industries do is to rely heavily on the informal sector. You've seen waste pickers, which means they go around collecting the waste, and that means a really significant fraction of plastic processed. And if you look at that, one of the reasons is that plastic recycling is very complicated. And if you go into one of these garbage dumps, you'll see the rag pickers sorting it out into different types of plastic, often manually. And it is a task, as I'd said, by very informal workers for the plastics that have actually higher resale value. So if you take a look at easily recyclable items like the PET bottles that we use, they can fetch as much as 42 rupees per kg. But multi-layer plastics, that's the real problem, because they're worth a pittance, something like rupees 5 to 10 per kg, and is often left unclaimed. So despite the fact that you have this informal sector, they also segregate out the plastics, and they'll only sell the ones that naturally, which are more remunerative for them, but leave behind a large amount of plastic waste that is there. And in rural areas, it gets compounded because plastics get burned in open fields or home, or even being used as wood fire in many homes to cook food, which releases harmful toxins into the air. So now let's look at what have been the efforts to combat this crisis or this menace that we have been looking at. In 2022, that's just about 3 years ago, the Indian government banned 19 single-use plastic items, including those used in cutlery, straws, thermocol trays, some things that we always use. It also tightened the rules on plastic bags and bottles and made sure that in terms of thickness, they were able to be recycled. Additionally, the government introduced what is called extended producer responsibility, which meant that the big companies that produce or import packaging are also responsible now for managing and recycling it fully. Now, beginning in April this year, beverage giants like Coke and Pepsi must use at least 30% of recycled plastic in their bottles. Despite the laws, one of the biggest problems in India is that implementation is lagging. There's very little implementation being done. And a 2023 survey found that in cities like Delhi and Gwalior, nearly 85% of shops were still using banned single-use plastics. In Mumbai, Bangalore, and Guwahati, the compliance rates were as alarmingly low. Enforcement mechanisms like pollution control boards and local municipal authorities simply lack the manpower or capacity to enforce the various new rules that have come out to ban plastic or ensure that its use is regulated. Meanwhile, there are recyclable alternatives, and if you remember, you could get bamboo cutlery, even bamboo toothbrushes, areca leaf tableware or paper cups, but all these are still very expensive and are not widely available. That prevents the mass adoption, especially among the middle and lower income consumers. So that's a problem. While you might have substitutes for these are too expensive, and so we continue to use a large amount of plastics in our daily life. Now let's look at what needs to be done. And let's look ahead and see what are the solutions. And these experts say we can't recycle our way out of this crisis as we simply produce too much plastic. So we can't just say that we will continue to recycle. We're producing large amounts of plastic. And even as we do a bit of the recycling, there's a lot more plastic that is being produced. So even with improved recycling, experts say that global plastic pollution will nearly triple by 2040, almost 3 times the current amount by 2040, despite various recycling measures. So unless production curbs occur, this number will keep growing phenomenally. The focus, therefore, must be what they call upstream, which means producing and consuming less plastic in the first place rather than trying to recycle them. So we must cut down on our production and consume, both in terms of production and consumption. We must ensure that there is far less than what we are doing now. So some sectors, plastics are critical. If you take a look at healthcare or aerospace, these are the sectors that will have to continue to employ plastics. But for our daily conveniences, whether it's cups, bottles, and other things, we need far better choices. So let's look at what we can do as individuals. Of course, the motto is we should start small, but think really big. And some of them are really simple and that we need to follow. Carry reusable bags. We normally go to a shop and then get another plastic bag. We come and dump it at home. That should be avoided. Straws to drink your cool drinks or lime juices. You can avoid that. Cutlery. Why do we need plastic cutlery? Many people, in fact, carry in their little bags a spoon or a plate so that they can use that to eat and then wash it there and then. So these are some of the best practices. And of course, water bottles. Why do we need water bottles? Maybe you can take a glass bottle and keep it in your car or wherever you need it. And whenever you need water, go and fill it up. Small things that are very, very important that can make a difference at a mass level. And of course, say no to single-use plastics, especially at street food stalls, shops, and railway platforms. All of them have these single-use plastics. In fact, some of them violate the norm so much, and they then form a major component of our landfills. You can easily avoid that as an individual. So think next time when you're going out, what can you do? And whenever you take something plastic, do you really need it? Can you use a substitute that will not pollute India and, of course, the earth? But let's be clear, individuals like us alone can't solve a crisis that is this big. So big firms must come in and they must think bigger, especially those that manufacture plastics. Firms must adopt responsible packaging, especially for the norm that had been prescribed, that is, they would use or recycle 30% of the plastic that they use in the first instance and keep upgrading that particular norm that has been imposed by the government. That is very critical. Also, the government needs more rigorous enforcement and stronger infrastructure. That is sorely lacking in India, and therefore we have such a high amount of waste that is not recycled, and if you look at it, that's one of the major reasons why we've become the world's #1 plastic emission polluter. Also, very, very important, it's just not enough for India to be doing it or China to be doing it. We need international cooperation. This is the key. In fact, in 2022, the United Nations tried to negotiate a treaty to ban plastics, or at least ensure that there is a global plastic pact that will reduce the amount of plastic that is being used across the world, and there would be a major program to find substitutes that are less harmful. The next round is set for August 5th to 14th in Geneva. That's just a month and a half away. And India should push hard for a pact and ensure that other nations should get into it. To conclude, plastic was and is a game-changing invention. There's no doubt about it. It is versatile, it's light and inexpensive, but when convenience becomes a menace, we find ourselves in a dangerous place. It's a global crisis, and by 2050, it is estimated that plastic waste could outweigh all the fish in the ocean. Think about it. There would be more plastic waste than there are fish in the ocean, and even exceed the combined human biomass. There might be more plastic packets and items than even humans are. That is a horrendous development. Think about that. India's massive contribution to plastic pollution shows just how urgent this issue has become. So it's for you to act and for all of us to act. And to know more about what needs to be done, do read the cover story done by my colleague Sonal Ketarpal in the latest issue of India Today. It's worth a read with a lot of solutions. I've given you the overview of why plastic is such a major problem, why it needs to be curtailed, and what you can do. But that issue will tell you a lot more. Thank you for being with me on this episode of Nothing But the Truth. I look forward to having you with me next week. Nothing but the truth.